In tonight's episode, the shadows of history meet the light of inquiry. Tonight, we delve into the swirling mists that surround the figure known as William Shakespeare. Was he the true authors of the works that bear his name? Or does the key to this enigma lie in the hidden cryptic depths of the past, obscured by time and tales? Join us as we explore theories that challenge the orthodox narrative, from the hallowed halls of the sonnets to the mysterious whispers of the Tudor court. Tonight, we peel back the layers of a literary mystery that has puzzled scholars and skeptics alike for centuries. From the intriguing Prince Tudor theory to the bold assertions of Edward de Vere's proponents, our journey will question the very fabric of literary history. What secrets do the sonnets hide? Who really was the man behind the quill? Prepare to question everything you thought you knew about the bard as we unravel the stories, the myths, and the scholarly debates that fuel the Shakespearean authorship question. We are the Conspiracy Realists, and as always, I'm your host, Shane Skwarek, joined by my esteemed co-host, Mr. Philipps.
Hey, how we doing?
And tonight we are not here alone. Tonight I am pleased to introduce a mind that swims against the tide, Alan Tarica. An explorer of the shadowy depths of literary history, Alan challenges the conventional narratives that have long defined the figure of William Shakespeare. Through meticulous research and innovative analysis, he invites us to reconsider what we think we know about the bard. His compelling insights into the Shakespearean authorship question, particularly his advocacy for Edward de Vere, opens new doors to understanding the true genius behind some of the most revered works in English literature. Alan, it's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thank you again for having me.
Always. Again, we appreciate you being our first official guest here on the Conspiracy Realist. So you're going to set the bar for everybody that comes after.
Well, I'm sure they'll manage well beyond what I have to say. But let me, I guess, introduce myself. For this purposes, I really don't have much to say about myself. I'm just an amateur researcher. I'm just someone who got interested in this topic because I honestly could not fathom why this was so mysterious. I mean, it didn't make sense to me why there was such thin evidence on the Stratford side, and conversely, thin evidence on the Oxfordian side in terms of actual documentary evidence of, this man was or was not Shakespeare, what he did and did not write, where his manuscripts were his writings, and it just, none of it added up. I mean, and clearly, I think it's quite obvious there's a very thin veneer of evidence that the Stratford man was Shakespeare, and that always struck me as odd. It was both there and not there at the same time. Mm-hmm. So the whole thing it kind of drew me in, and I started out as just an interested observer, and I just slowly gained momentum by sort of joining, the Shakespeare Oxford Society, for example, and the de Vere Society, and actually, I may not have member. Yeah, I believe I was a member of both. I'm not a member of either because I've just lost all patience with them, and I'm sure that's mutual. But yeah, no, I just don't have much to say in the regard of, who I am, other than, I'm just an interested amateur, and I just think the topic was worthy of discussion, but clearly the discussion never seemed to progress in a way that I've found compelling. And, I did get interested by virtue of the work that Roger Strittmatter had done on Shakespeare's Bible. That was my introduction, and that seemed very intriguing, but that seemed never to actually have gone anywhere significant. So
you mentioned that was your introduction there. Were you always fascinated by literature? I mean, what really drove you toward Shakespeare to begin with?
Not at all. It just, the fact that it was a mystery intrigued me. The fact that, it didn't strike me as something that should be a mystery. Mm-hmm. You have a man of letters who is so mysterious that it's such an incongruity. Usually when it's a pseudonym, it's obvious it's a pseudonym and it's known, or an Alan. But this just seemed weird to me. And I needed to get to I wanted to help I expected to be sort of assist others to get to the bottom. I had no
Sure.
expectation that I would come up with any solutions at all. I wasn't foreseeing that in the least when I started this.
It's kind of a fun tale too, because I think a lot of us, especially those that are going to be listening, we always sort of kind of grasp onto any of these theories or any of these mysteries of the past, right? And I think that's the same entry for everyone is you're just sort of gravitate towards it because it sounds pretty interesting. It sounds intriguing. And I think the end goal is to be able to say like, oh my God, like I found this nugget that maybe everybody else just overlooked, or maybe they were missing the whole way through. So kind of a cool journey.
That's what I was trying to do initially. I was trying to like say, "Hey, I found this," and and point the people I considered more qualified and better capable of advancing things, and I felt like they either dropped the ball or never picked up the ball, or just.
I suspect that's going to be a recurring theme as we talk today is people that are more qualified, and I intentionally use that in quotes, aren't necessarily more qualified because of a couple acronyms after their name. I want to jump back and kind of just talk about Shakespeare, sort of the conventional narrative of who he is. Tim, you and I both have some young kids. If you had to describe Shakespeare to your kids, how would you describe him?
Yeah, I think in its most simplest terms, I would probably say that he was the most accomplished and well-known playwright of history, right? I wouldn't. I was going to say our time, but clearly it's not our time. That would be incorrect. But I would say of all time, right? From what I know about Shakespeare, or at least thought I knew about Shakespeare, the person who we're all taught who he is when we're young kids in school. That's what I would have to say about him. And when we kind of stumbled upon this, my mind was blown because I really, Alan, as I had kind of mentioned to you off the record before we started recording, up until a short time ago, I'd never even known there was any kind of controversy surrounding his identity. So my mind was completely blown. And when we found out you were coming on, I was like, this is going to be so cool. But long answer to your very short question, the most successful playwright in history. That's what I would say.
Right.
Even writer in history, perhaps.
Right.
And many people would make that argument. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I guess that's really where it gets really interesting and a good segue. Tim, Alan, you're proposing the story of Shakespeare is not what it seems. We've established that. So I think, and your research has actually showed that it's somebody else entirely. Who is that?
Well, it's not just my research. So Thomas J. Looney, a schoolmaster from England in the early 1900s, sometime around 1916, I forget, just before World War I believe, he had come up with the Oxfordian theory. He decided that, and I'm not even sure I believe his story about how he said he went about it in terms of trying to find a candidate that met certain criteria. And he developed this list of criteria, and then he went and did a search of people in the, sort of the database of his English historical figures and writers, and matched the criteria he had with the person. And he claimed he found Oxford this way. And maybe that happened. Maybe that is the way it happened. But I almost believe there was an oral tradition in his family because there were other people, like other writers at the time, and like Nabokov, for example, who was also highly fascinated with the Oxfordian hypothesis, that couldn't have learned it, and he had it so ingrained in him just because of by the time Looney had written his work. At least I don't believe that. So right. I have suspicions. I mean, I'm a person willing to be suspicious in general. Like, there's nothing wrong with suspicion.
You sound like
in my view. I mean, but people will treat suspicion in certain areas as if it's taboo. I mean, it's kind of comical to me. But yeah, that's how the Oxfordian movement started, and then people advanced it. I talked about Ogburn, obviously. I sent you an article about how I felt Ogburn's book was probably the most influential thing that advanced Oxfordian theory, because he had really reached the intellectual class of the U.S., and he had really reached the Supreme Court justices who really sort of made the issue sort of famous as a reasonable semi-intellectual pursuit amongst people who had were educated, and sort of made it still a little bit respectable. There was a period in the late 80s, early 90s where I think a lot more people actually did consider it and considered it a somewhat respectable pursuit. And there was a point where Renee Montaigne from NPR actually spent time with, Oxfordians, and she had very glowing remarks about them and reported that, what delightful, well-educated, reasonable people they were. And so, there were points in time where people were receptive to this, but they just I don't think they had the information to have the kind of conversation that I'm hoping that we can have.
And so just to backtrack and give some context on the Oxfordian theory, what is that in its simplest terms?
So this aristocrat, this noble, this gentleman from one of the most renowned families in England, the de Veres, because they went all the way back to the Battle of Hastings with Aubrey de Vere. And so Edward de Vere was the 17th Earl of Oxford. He had inherited that title through 17 generations.
Wow.
He was the actual writer. And you've researched the Prince Tudor theory, and I don't know if we want to get into that.
Oh, we will. Yep.
At some point, I would love to.
Yeah. So, that's an integral part of my theory. But yeah, in terms of the Oxfordian theory, I didn't develop it. I didn't develop most of the evidence for it in terms of linking him and his biography to the works. Yeah, I I can't take credit for that. I don't want to take credit for that.
Sure.
I think there's a lot of people who have done really important and good work there. I don't want to detract from them. So yeah, that information has been out there. It's been out there for 100, well, not quite 100 years, because in the 50s and 60s, I don't remember when Ogburn published his book, but that's been out for a while, and he got a lot wrong, but
right.
But he was almost the grandfather, if you will, or godfather, kind of the Oxford theory, right?
I believe so. I think that's a reasonable characterization. I mean, he was an interesting person in his own regard, and but yeah, he did some really good work, and he was very influential. He deserves credit, in my view, for sure. I mean, there's been a lot of people. His whole family. It was interesting. He inherited the interest from his parents. It was, it was
Wow.
a generational thing. His family is sort of the Oxfordian royalty in a sense. But which I found amusing and ironic.
Yeah,
But
what a
at any
thing to
rate,
pass on from generation to generation. Kind of get it wrapped up in a mystery, right? It reminds me of
Right.
like a National Treasure movie or something. That
And
degree.
that's
You get the
happened to
grandfather and
there
father.
are other Oxfordians who also inherited their interest from their parents. I mean, that's almost it's sort of understandable that you would, because you don't necessarily run into this topic in mainstream media, right? You really have to go out of your way to find it generally. Or if you run into it, it's because it's being ridiculed as this ridiculous conspiracy theory.
Completely dismissed. Yep.
Right.
So, I mean, obviously, Edward de Vere is not the only person that people have speculated is William Shakespeare. We've got
Correct.
Christopher
Obviously.
Marlowe, Francis Bacon,
Right.
Mary Sidney. I've got William Stanley, a group of people. Have you ever
Absolutely.
looked at any of these other theories?
A little bit, but mostly it was relatively obvious to me that the Oxfordian case was the strongest, even before I had developed anything. And so I was mostly interested in that, and I was mostly interested then in the motivation for why Oxford would do it. So I wasn't necessarily dismissive of these other theories, but you have to understand, once you understand the Oxfordian theory, you understand that Marlowe was actually emulating Shakespeare, not the other way around.
Okay.
And with respect to Baconian theory, Bacon just wasn't the kind of personality to write Shakespeare. He was a brilliant person in his own right, but his, the scientific mind that he had just didn't seem congruous with who Shakespeare was. So I never put much stock in those theories, and I just never found a lot of evidence in the other theories. I can't claim that I did a lot of exploration, but the little bit of exploration I did, none of them really just made any sense to me.
So you already touched on Prince Tudor. Let's dive right into it. I know you've studied that quite extensively. What is the Prince Tudor theory?
Well, there's several versions. I see you've done your homework. There's several versions. The only version that I'm interested in is that Edward de Vere had a relationship with Queen Elizabeth and produced an heir, and then proceeded to hide that heir in the Southampton household, so that heir became the third Earl of Southampton, and that was Henry Wriothesley. Rosalie, however you.
Yeah, I could not figure out how to say his name when I would look at it. It's a very long, sophisticated name.
I should know it actually, but there's so many people.
I said it out loud about 75 different times last night and pronounced it in 75 different ways, and I'm like, none of these sound right to me.
We'll just call him Henry. Henry W.
Sure. Yeah, that works. We can do that.
So
yeah. I mean, it's a pretty simple theory, right? Like, and it's strange to me that people don't discount it so much. I had a collaborator named Ron Hess, and he just used to go crazy with this notion of royal bastards, as if it was so outrageous, as if people don't have sex, as if there's never been an unplanned pregnancy, as if it's just so like alien. He talked as if aliens came to Earth and had that was the nature of this,
especially in a time where abortion wasn't a thing.
Right.
Yeah. What do you do with a child that? Yeah, and male monarchs did this all the time. They had all kinds of children that they that ended up being aristocrats and that weren't recognized as royal but were clearly got preferred treatment in life. Yeah. So
I think people like to look back at history with a different colored lens. You put a lot of these historical figures up on this pedestal, and of course it's what we're being taught in school, and you always remember all the good that they've done, but you never think that they are human. They aren't all perfect, and that goes as in recent history, as even way back. And I think when talking about royalty too, you see it right now with all the royal families and whatnot's going on over in Europe. And the slightest bit of dissension that happens, or the slightest bit of them being kind of out of the public eye, and you're just rattling off all these conspiracies of what's going on and who's got what disease and who's being faked by AI. And so I'm with you in that. For me, it's not a far stretch of the imagination to think that, hundreds of years ago, all of a sudden somebody had an affair and a kid was born. It just, it seems pretty plausible.
Like to think, yeah, well, in fact, it's almost inevitable in the sense that when you consider that this guy, he was not just Shakespeare, let's have to imagine that he's Shakespeare. So he's incredibly eloquent, right? But he's also apparently incredibly athletic. He was a champion jouster. He was known for his dancing ability, and the Queen liked that, irrespective of this theory. And he just had to have been an object of her desire in some sense, right? So it's just, yeah. And they actually had a documented sort of fling, if you will. There was an obvious documented attraction and time where they spent quite a bit of time together, and yet she was just in right around her mid-30s, where she was just still, clearly a fertile woman who could quite obviously have a child.
Right.
So all of these things, regardless of my ideas, and we can get there if you want, But I mean, I think
we're going.
So my thought is, that I've gone to the effort of putting an entire narrative to 154 sonnets that lays out exactly why this did indeed happen. I mean, give me at least credit for the speculative fiction and creating my own literary work that somehow, creates this alternative universe.
Yep.
Give me at least that. And people won't they won't do any, I'm a pariah for various, because I'm incredibly militant about this, because it's not just that I'm the someone who's providing a heterodox idea. I do this out of the motivation of wanting to be a recipient of heterodox ideas, and I can't stand that people would obviously not allow those things to be heard, would filter them out, and so that's kind of my motivation here.
So the sonnets, we talked about that. I've looked at your website. You have them all laid out, but curiously, you have them laid out in reverse order, where you have sonnet 154 at the top and sonnet number 1 at the bottom. I assume, because of all the research you've done and how much you've kind of explored this subject, that is not an accident.
No, it's not. That's the order that they were composed in. That's my theory, that's the order they were composed. And the overarching theory is that they were composed as Edward de Vere's advocacy is essentially lobbying Elizabeth to recognize their son, to utilize their son, to live on through their son. And so they were reversed for publication to sort of provide, to slightly make them sort of not obvious, to slightly get around them being, obviously just banned, and which they obviously were banned because they were actually lost for almost a century and a half.
Right, in that period, for sure. Yeah.
And that alone is very suspicious. And that wasn't just because, they would have represented homosexuality or some, it just that the traditional explanations make zero sense to me. They seem incoherent to me. Clearly something larger was going on across the board to explain all of the weirdness that's going on, in my view. So yeah, they were written in reverse order from how they were published. And by doing that, I believe you solve all manner of problems. One problem you solve is the rival poet isn't actually another person, a rival poet. It's just a metaphor for the better expression that Henry W. provides for Elizabeth living than Oxford can possibly express through his words, regardless of how eloquent he is. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So immediately you have a simpler theory. I've eliminated one character because and by reversing them, you also clear up some of the gender issues that sort of reveal that the Dark Lady the procreation is really the metaphor for her recognizing her child. It's not about the fair youth, mysteriously, Shakespeare being obsessed with the fair youth having a child, literally. The child's already there. Right. He's arguing for Elizabeth to utilize the child.
Right. So the fair youth isn't some figurative, imaginative character. It actually, the fair youth actually exists.
The fair youth always existed, even by the other theory. But the fair youth is, it's his child. It's his paternal relationship, and that's why there's this seeming triangle, right? That's how they're all actually interconnected, as opposed to this weird love triangle that scholars have concocted, where she's this mysterious dark lady, and she's like causing problems between him and his this mysterious other fair youth that he's obsessed with, and obsessed that he has a child somehow. They always throw in that he's obsessed with seeing this guy marry and procreate, but there's no talk of marriage. It's just all about, that's the assumption, that he wants to see him get married and procreate. But no, the reality is this procreation is all a metaphor. Everything in Shakespeare wrote in metaphors. He thought in metaphors. You can read traditional scholars and they will tell you that. So
one of the things that kind of strikes me then is that as you read through these sonnets and you're reading them in reverse order, it's outlining this story for you. How do you sort of separate, what is a metaphor and what is the truth as you're kind of delving in this rabbit hole and just kind of just figuring out, what can you add to each side,
Well, it's not easy, and I don't know if I have any examples that come to mind. I actually haven't even read my own work in a substantial amount of time.
I'm
That's
sure
okay.
it's
I don't watch
overwhelming
your own
too.
videos often, so that's okay.
But God, there was one particular instance I should be able to remember that the canopy, the bearing of the canopy. I don't know if you're familiar with that sonnet. I don't remember which one it is. But that struck people have been looking for how the Stratford man could have possibly literally bore the canopy. And the canopy is this ceremonial thing that you hold. You lift the queen up and carry her, and that's the canopy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's been countless ridiculous conversations about how the Stratford man did this, and of course Oxfordians like to point out that Oxford would have literally done this. But the reality is, it's just a metaphor. The metaphor for lifting her up is he provided the air. He did what everybody else, like, she was in constant marriage negotiations. She was constantly, everybody else wanted to be her suitor and provide her the air. And England was looking for this native son, but he did it. And that's what he's conveying there. He bore the canopy. So
It's fascinating. It really is.
So
Go ahead.
jumping in real quick. So, Alan, what I think is bizarre, right, about the reverse order of the sonnets and when they were published. How did you stumble? I don't want to say stumble across, right, but how did you even begin to think of, hey, let me reverse the order of the sonnets as to how they were published, and why were they published in that order, and how does that kind of affect this whole theory?
So it wasn't that complicated. So I started developing this understanding of how the sonnets work.
Uh-huh.
And so I realized that what were supposed to be the early numbered sonnets appeared later, and the latter number sonnets appeared earlier. And then it just dawned on me one day. I was waiting outside the grocery store for I think my wife, and that if they were flipped, and then it immediately dawned on me that those damn initials are all, flipped. Everyone always wondered, why is it W? Why is it? It's Henry Rosalie, and it should be. So I immediately made that connection, and then I made this huge mental note to myself to go see if I could make this whole flip thing work. If that actually works, because I was only doing this in my head, and then so I had to go through that exercise of actually making it work, and there were some stumbling blocks there, of course, because I kept, I'm no literary genius. I was making all kinds of mistakes and trying to understand and trying to wade through these deep metaphors at times that nobody was understanding, and so it was a struggle, but it wasn't that much of a struggle. Mostly it came sort of naturally.
Hold on for a second, because you just said something that I was completely not aware about. You said the initials were flipped. So when they found Shakespeare's original works that were being published, he signed them HW, not...
No, it's dedicated to Mr. WH, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Those are the initials I'm talking about.
Got it. Okay.
So who is this? Everybody's always wondered about who this mysterious WH is.
Right.
And,
that makes total sense.
But yet the two poems, Venus and Adonis and Rape of Lucrece, were clearly dedicated to the third Earl of Southampton. So, the expectation is that, clearly he's an influential figure in Shakespeare's life, right?
Right.
And that also, I believe, I already had the paternal relationship in mind when I started reading the sonnets, and I already had PT in mind when I started reading, because PT was really splintering the whole Oxfordian movement. It was, when I joined it, it was this mess where the two camps had actually physically separated into the camp that was at least willing to consider the PT, and those who were completely unwilling to consider PT. And for whatever crazy reason, I at first joined the I joined the PT camp, but then I got estranged from them, and then I joined the un-PT camp. because I had a person more local to me, and more immediate relationships, right? To so at any rate, it's kind of it's a bit messy, but yeah, it was an incredibly messy time in in Oxfordian history, if you will, air quotes there.
Is it fair to say that, and this is in my very limited research of the subject, right? I am nowhere near in the stretch of the imagination as well versed as you are, but is it fair to say that within the PT theory, it actually kind of cleans up, or it kind of makes it easier for the possibility or the theory of Shakespeare to be somebody else based upon the metaphors in which he wrote and what he was writing about, that it had to be a pseudonym, and
Well,
if it was, right, an illegitimate child, and that he would be writing in metaphors instead of coming out and saying these things. Does that kind of make sense?
that does make sense. That does make sense. But what I find somewhat amusing is that the PTers never realized, in my view, the effect that this would have on just not just Shakespeare but everyone, because you have, like, think about how much effort and interest we invest in our elections, and how in our political candidates, and how important that is to us. Our determining our, think about if that leadership was for a lifetime, and think about if you never had that opportunity. Essentially, you don't get to choose your monarch. Your monarch is born, but all of a sudden you have the ability to support a potential monarch as opposed to a foreign monarch. You had this choice between Henry W. or King James from Scotland. Was essentially the two. There were other possibilities, but these were essentially the two things that were going to come ultimately down the pike. That this, once Elizabeth died, I mean, you had these two choices, right? So think about, there's going to be an obvious advocacy for the native son, the son of Shakespeare, the literal son of Shakespeare, because, and I think that's how Bacon is involved in this. I think there was a huge political movement. I think scholars have missed the entire Elizabethan period because, works like Astrophil and Stella, it's not Philip Sidney writing his about himself. He's writing a satire of Oxford wooing Elizabeth. And that's what Stella is, the star, she's the queen. Astrophil is this bitter herb that he had this very big rivalry with Oxford, and they had this very contentious relationship, and they even had a very famous tennis court quarrel where, they almost killed each other, I would imagine. And that was the source of this. I think what Sidney's really arguing is it was not for Oxford to meddle, even though it was not for him to influence her decision. And I may be wrong about how, but yeah, he's writing. I feel like that poem is clearly satire, and I feel like all of Elizabethan literature is really about this. It's about these various camps and the various support, and it ultimately culminated when it became clear that Elizabeth wasn't going to make the decision. Then what we know as the Essex Rebellion happened, and it's the most ridiculously motivated event by traditional scholarship. It's that Essex was angry that he lost his sweet wine patent, and he had other. No, this was the effort to force Elizabeth to recognize Southampton, and clearly it failed. That's why this all got buried. But yeah, there's an enormous level of very important history here, and when you miss this, you miss essentially all of the meat of the Elizabethan period, in my view. It's just that they foobarred this so badly that they refuse to even think about recovering. I mean, and that's my take. That it would be comical if it's not so tragic. I mean, it really is a tragic loss of history.
I think that's what's so fascinating about the Tudor theory, PT theory, whatever you want to call it, is it almost kind of rewrites Elizabethan history. right? If
It
we can prove
absolutely
that it is
does.
true.
It really does. It literally
Yeah.
does. There's no question in my mind that it does. Yeah.
And
I mean,
might explain
and
why your mainstream scholars are so opposed to even having that conversation about it, right? We know that folks in power don't like to admit their mistakes or admit that there was an alternate possibility that could have occurred. So that that could be that.
Right. Did you choose the wrong leader? Was there really supposed to be a different leader? And Alan, you sort of answered a question that I had in the midst of when you were just talking, is when you brought up the political ramifications. It's not even something I'd even considered, because it's not lost on me, but it's easy to forget that you aren't elected into power at this point, right? You are born
right.
into it. And so, this whole time I'm thinking along the lines of, what was Edward's goal behind this? Was it just a love story to Queen Elizabeth, or was he trying to actually change her mind? You answered that. Clearly,
Yeah.
the ultimate goal was to say, hello, like, this is your son too. He should be considered
Right.
for lineage. Why wouldn't he just kind of come out and make a big fuss about it?
Well, he also respected monarchical power. He also, he also respected English. He didn't want, he wasn't going to be that disruptive. He
Sure.
had too much respect for for the monarchy and for things to just destroy. He wasn't, yeah, that just wasn't in him to do, right? And when it failed, he accepted that fate, um, and everyone moved on. They just basically forgot it.
Right.
And I was watching just 60 Minutes just prior to this, and there was a story about how in the Channel Islands the Nazis were running apparently essentially a concentration camp, or literally a concentration camp, and the British buried this. This is the way history actually works. When it's too uncomfortable, people just bury it, right?
Look the other way.
And that's what and that's what I believe happened here. This was a very uncomfortable situation that it didn't do anyone any good to revisit this. It failed. It was a failed effort to make Southampton, monarch, and then it just got buried. There was no point in dredging it. But that's not to say that I think the first folio was actually published as a work of political dissent. It was a reminder to King James that we remember this.
Right.
And the first folio was published during what was known as the Spanish marriage crisis, where they were going to marry James's son off to a this is another instance of foreign rule potentially becoming involved in England. That's what this is really about. Like, this is about the maintenance of English rule. And that's why everyone got so wrapped up in this, mostly, in my view. This is a huge piece of hidden history.
Is it also kind of, fair to say that maybe Edward, I mean, he's challenging a monarch, right? There's some fear there about going up against the English monarchy, right?
There absolutely is. But he would have given his life for that. To have his progeny, his line become royal, that was the ultimate goal. I mean, being aristocratic is great, but high birth is like you want higher birth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So he would have sacrificed himself, I believe. I mean, he was just this was so important to him, even on that level. But on the level of, seeing a native son be monarch of England, that was important for everyone, in addition to him. There were lots of other people involved in this, and that's why there was this big concealed effort. It was a propaganda movement, really. Shakespeare was a brand and a propaganda movement to promote, the Prince Tudor succession.
So is there a real person that existed by the name of William Shakespeare?
Yeah, there absolutely was a William Shakespeare, what they call it. It's a short A.
Mm-hmm.
And he obviously lived in Stratford upon Avon, and his father was John Shakespeare, and before I started in on the sonnets, I wanted to understand where Edward de Vere's manuscripts were, and so I did a little bit of amateur sleuthing, if you will, and I was tracing. I've gone into this conversation before, but there are multiple forms of handwriting, kind of analogous to what we have, and though nobody writes anymore. But we have our print and our cursive. Well,
right.
If people of our generation, at least,
Yeah, my kids not so much, but yeah, I hear you.
Right. They may not relate so well, but yeah, they had similar forms of handwriting then. They had what they called italic, which was essentially print, and they had English secretary, which is essentially cursive. And we don't have any examples of Oxford's secretary. So that just seemed a big red flag to me. He would have had both. Everyone did. So I went looking for it. And when I went looking for it, I thought I had seen it in the coat of arms. Hints of it in the coat of arms. And then I confirmed that in my mind, at least, by finding his italic in the coat of arms. And his italic is actually where he wrote the name John Shakespeare, because he was applying for the coat of arms on behalf of his father. So there are 3 of these coat of arms applications. The third one got approved. It was approved without the last A in Shakespeare. And I think that's a little bit interesting in and of itself.
Yeah.
There was quite a controversy surrounding them. But at any rate, I have a separate theory where I believe Edward de Vere himself created those coat of arms applications, and he did it he created the front himself. The way I imagine this happened is he created this problem by creating the Shakespeare name, and the Queen got pissed off and said, "You fix this," and he said, "Sure, I'll fix it." And so he literally created this absurd frontman that nobody believed. And that's the irony, that nobody actually believed the Stratford man was Shakespeare during this time.
Right.
It's kind of comical. The evidence is so it's just nobody attended his funeral. Nobody cared. It's just every indication is that nobody actually believed it. And and that's
even during that time period.
Even during that time period, yeah. They had to pretend to believe it. I mean, it was the official government word. That was
that was the narrative at that point.
And when you're in a totalitarian society, what the government says, okay, sure, yeah, whatever you say, we believe it, no problem. But no one, in theory, no one really believed it, is what I'm claiming. And but Edward de Vere deliberately created this conflation of the Stratford man with the name Shakespeare that already existed prior to. He only did it out of necessity later. And he did it really as a hoax, essentially.
So what does that mean for the plays that were written? I mean, some of the most famous of the world, obviously the Hamlets, the Romeo and Juliets. Is that all de Vere, or was that...
Yeah,
that was still him?
It's de Vere, and he had you have to understand, Oxford employed a whole host of writers.
Mm-hmm.
So he wrote all the good stuff. There's stuff that's obviously Shakespeare, right? There's stuff that obviously only Shakespeare could write.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I mean, he was a unique talent. But the plays contain all manner of not Shakespearean work. And, undoubtedly he had secretaries and other people helping him create these plays. And their incentive was not just that he was paying them, but I believe their incentive was that this was an important propaganda tool, and it was also possibly used to as a finance way to help their propaganda, as a way to help finance the propaganda. So
meanings essentially, right, that his cast of writers, if you want to call them that, they
Sure.
bought in, they believed into Oxford, into the movement and what it stood for, and more so than just financial reasons, they were behind the cause, if you will.
Absolutely, yes. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay,
right.
Interesting.
And Oxford owned this. I'm not the only one to. Part of this theory is that there was a property Oxford bought. It's interesting. Oxford is considered very a profligate spender, but I believe he actually found really good values. And there was a property he bought called Fisher's Folly. It was Fisher's Folly, not Oxford. Fisher was this wealthy jewelry, I believe, goldsmith. He was in the whatever he was. He built this house he couldn't quite afford, and so he had to sell it. And I think Oxford got a really good deal on it, and so he purchased it. And other Oxfordians will recognize that this became the scriptorium, if you will. This became the place where all his writers came together, and this is where Shakespeare, the works were written, most essentially. And I believe that that's highly plausible. I think that's very likely what took place.
I can't help but think back on the plays and now doing it with the context of Ed de Vere and thinking of Romeo and Juliet, right? And you've got a man and a woman who are in love, but because of their families and where they were birthed, they can never be together. A love letter to Queen Elizabeth. I can't help but think of Julius Caesar and, Et tu, Brute, getting stabbed by Brutus and feeling like you're stabbed in the back by the woman you loved, or Hamlet, where it's about revenge. It's just all of a sudden this whole new context kind of comes into play for a common man that would have had these thoughts, as we were told. But now it makes sense, right? It's like you literally, it was almost like an autobiography in the way he was feeling in each of these plays, at least the tone of them.
I agree. And I've even made the case that, you wouldn't necessarily see the connection in Othello.
Mm-hmm.
But I've argued, and I believe that Othello, as a North African amongst Venetians, this was really a woman among men, and he's really conveying the idea that of her hubris to think that she is accepted among these men, and they're not actually manipulating her and working against her best interest.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can go through essentially all the plays and find these new connections, in my view. And it's
that's like a right now, like light bulb moment for me in this conversation. It's just like, again, having done the research and stuff, just as you kind of talked through the political ramifications here, as you sort of talked about the birth, and just it clicks, right? And it makes a lot of sense.
Well, I'm glad you find it. It's at least good speculative fiction, right? I've created an alternative universe that somehow makes sense.
Well, maybe we can merge that universe with this one. I know people are reluctant.
I'm sort of doubtful, in all honesty.
Well, one of the things that kind of drives me crazy, again, the podcast is called Conspiracy Realist. We tagline it, "Cocktails and Conspiracies" is why we always have a drink. Just kind of casually talk about these types of things. And I think that's the key word, is casually, right? And I think in the world of conspiracy, people get really hung up on the exact words, and they are so quick to, when you believe something, when you believe in Shakespeare and you believe everything there is about him because that's what your textbook told you, that's what you learned growing up, really easy to buy into that. But then you see holes in that theory. Well, you just dismiss that because, Shakespeare was who he was and he wrote all these plays. On the converse side, you're presented with this alternative universe, so to speak, that somebody else actually wrote all this, and there was a whole big conspiracy behind all of it. And then what people do is they harp now on those one or two things that are off. There could be 100 holes in the official story, which by any context, I think in the last, 50 minutes, that's what we found. We've poked holes in the official narrative. But they're going to harp on those one or two things that maybe we can't quite figure out, that you have to speculate on. And it just blows my mind a little bit that's how people respond, is just they're going to latch onto that little piece there.
Right. Well, and true, and that's to be expected to some extent, right? Because it has to stand up to scrutiny,
of course.
But I personally feel like I've solved many of the issues and objections, and that's what galls me, I guess, is that they won't reconsider. I don't know, what more to say about that. But
well, so that kind of leads me into my next question. As you mentioned today several times throughout the entire interview today, or the entire discussion, what has this deep dive into the Prince Tudor theory, into Ed de Vere, into Shakespeare, How has this impacted your life? What has this done to you? And who really are they?
Oh, well, it sadly might have made me more cynical, and I didn't start off particularly positive and the most yeah. But yeah, it's very disturbing. I mean, partly I guess what disturbs me is that how much people think they can control the message by not allowing the conversation. And I guess it scares me how much they actually can, because everyone is so complicit in journalists won't touch this. They won't. I get no coverage. I've reached out to I reach out to people all the time, and they're all aware of me. In fact, partly I get them to complain about me to illustrate that they're aware of me. It's really mine. And, I sort of learned a little trick from Shakespeare, is how to manipulate people into doing your, what you want, at least indirectly. It's very discouraging. It's discouraging, as I said, because I want to be the recipient of ideas. I want to know about the best ideas. And if I think they can be filtered out, that is just very frightening and very an unpleasant thought, to say the least. I want to be in a actual marketplace of ideas. I want to hear the best ideas. I want to be able to judge those ideas for myself. I don't want this filter, and it scares me to think that there is this filter. And so, at least, thank you guys for offering this opportunity to share in a way that I can't normally do.
Well, of course, and appreciate your time. I mean, this is, again, so insightful for us. As Tim said earlier, it's something that we walked into this literally not knowing that there was something to question at all. And I think it is hard, especially when you've dedicated so much time to it, and you found a reason that this should be believed, and just kind of be dismissed because people just don't want to hear the truth. I think it's something that kind of echoes into anything, just even outside of Shakespeare, to today's society, right? People are very quick to be dismissive, and they're very quick to just kind of shun people that have different ideas. And we've seen so many times throughout history, and in every realm, in science, in literature, and in history itself, that sometimes those ideas are often found to be true much later. We thought the Earth was flat for very many years, and then we figured out it was actually a globe. And now some people think it's flat again. So I guess maybe it is cyclical. But nevertheless, people tend to find these things. It would be hilarious, actually, if it came full circle and we're flat Earth again. But no, thank you, Alan. Tim, any other kind of closing thoughts you want to throw in before we wrap this up?
No, like I alluded to earlier when we first started this, right? And you kind of just mentioned it. I didn't know there was anything to even possibly think about in regard to Shakespeare. And then I started kind of, I wouldn't even say deep diving, but I started just looking at the surface and looking at all of the different possibilities. And, I found that the Oxfordian theory was, the most well-known and probably most well-established theory of them all, and kind of, took a bit of a deeper dive into that. And then, Alan, you sent us a lot of information, and we started looking into your work, and now having to actually sit down and have a conversation with you. Dude, I'm going to be busy for a long time, man. I got a lot of rabbit holes to go down. I'm excited. So thank you. I guess that's all I have to say is thank you.
Well, I guess the irony, I'll leave you, the irony is the literature is about telling stories and engaging in imaginative pursuits, correct? So to suggest that people can't imagine a larger, more important context or appreciate the storytelling opportunities of it, it just seems disingenuous to me. It seems mendacious in some sense, but yeah, it's very discouraging, as I said, and I hope people will take that and see the positive of having the conversation, of really needing to have these conversations. You can't just shun ideas. If you can't refute the idea, you have to consider the idea. And that's really, where I would leave people.
Very well said. Very well said. As we close this episode of the Conspiracy Realist, to our audience, I just want to say that we've ventured through the foggy realms of history, questioning the very authorship of Shakespeare's works, from the aristocratic halls of Edward de Vere to the secretive sonnets, speaking hidden languages and royal intrigues. The theories I think that we've explored challenge us to think beyond the accepted narratives. Whether these theories prompt skepticism or belief, they certainly enrich our understanding of the literary and historical landscapes of Elizabethan England. Thank you for joining us on this intriguing journey into the past. We are the Conspiracy Realists, signing off until next time.